And welcome back. We are going today to talk about pivot points. And pivot points are simply have to refer to when we want to rotate an object. And it has to refer to its point of origin. If you look here, we have kind of one point of origin. You can see it's right here in the center of this object. So if I were to come in here and rotate this object, as I start to rotate it in its various spheres, you'll notice that we have it still, no matter how I rotate this, it rotates around that original axis point there. Doesn't matter which axis I use, it will always rotate around that center. Now, when we start talking about these pivot points, something I want to show real quick, if we go to our top view real quick, and if I were to switch back over to selection, you can see if I have all of these points here, the median point is referring to the median point of these objects. So it doesn't simply just refer to just this. So with all these selected, if I were to go ahead and rotate, you can see the median point right now is rotating around the kind of the middle of those three objects. Doesn't really matter where this is, but you can see where it's at. It kind of gives some important context. And we can choose that or change it by coming up here where this kind of like almost like a paperclip, or you can think of it as two circles with a dot in it. This is the pivot point. And in here we have, of course, options. There's bounding box, 3D cursor, individual origins, and median point. So at median point is kind of the default where it usually acts under, because that's where this is operating under, is the middle of this. But of course, we can look at other ones. So for example, let's go ahead and look at individual origins. So with the individual origins selected, if we go ahead and start rotating these, I'm just going to press R here. You can see as I rotate these, you can see each object now kind of rotates individually around its own origin point. You'll see the square or the cube has its origin point right here in the middle. The lamp is working right here, but you'll notice that the lamp doesn't appear to be rotating, and that's because if we look at this ramp, if we look at the lamp and we go into its settings, one thing you'll notice with this light is that it is set up as a point lamp. So we gotta go to our data here, and you can see it's a point lamp. If I change that to, let's say, a spot lamp, and then I apply the rotation, you can see how that changes. So if we go ahead and select all these here and rotate it, you will see how that, of course, now they can all rotate individually. But if we change this back to median again and rotate, now you'll see they rotate around kind of more of the center point here rather than the individual origins of each shape. I'm going to change this back to point real quick here. And if we look at 3D cursor, the big thing you have to know with 3D cursor is that it is this kind of reticle that we have right now in the middle of our cube. And if I switch over to cursor here, I can simply just click and I can move that cursor as a new point of origin. And so then when we go to rotate, you'll see that it'll rotate pieces around there. So if I, for example, go to here, let's make this our cube now and rotate it, you'll see that we can rotate around that 3D cursor now instead of being bound to where we were previously. Let's go ahead and do a little bit of work here. We're going to go ahead and go back to our cube real quick here. And so I'm actually just going to go ahead and say, you know, I want to take this cube here and I want to, let's say, go ahead and move that back up here. So let's go ahead and take them up just a little bit so we can see it a little better. And I'm going to go ahead and get ready to extrude here on certain sides of this cube here. So if we go to edit mode, and let's just go to our faces real quick. Let's go ahead and select this face and go ahead and extrude that face out. And let's extrude this one and maybe the top face as well. It doesn't really matter too much of which one we kind of work with here, but this is just to kind of give some arbitrary thing to kind of play around with. Now let's go ahead and just select our faces here. All right, because I just want to show you something, because we are currently, if we look at our mode here for how we are doing this, and I go ahead and scale this, you'll notice that it scales a little differently. Because again, we're on this time, now our mode, if we go back to object here real quick, we can see we have this different modes that we've been operating in versus what we have been used to with our mode. So when we are normally doing this, remember this is under median, but now we are operating under the individual origins. And so that's part of the reason why when we go to scale this, we start getting some of this more kind of unique geometry going on. And if I ever want to check, I can just come up here. You can see right now we're actually in 3D cursor mode. And so scaling that, of course, it gives me this. If I switch this over to individual origins, you can see how that will affect that as well. Median point, of course, you can, again, see how those are working and how this can still play in with rotation. We can really start messing with some of our geometry here based upon the different kind of layers and rotations and everything, that we can really start making some cool shapes that we didn't really think that we could really handle before. All right, so let's go ahead and take what we just learned here and go ahead and apply that to, let's just say we want to make, let's say, a trapdoor or something like that. So I'm just going to go ahead, make a new shape, and let's go ahead and scale this. Let's go ahead and do by the Z. And using the Z-axis, let's go down to, let's say, 0.1. Just so we have a pretty thin shape here to get started with. All right, so let's go ahead and take our floor here, if you will. And I'm just going to go ahead and rename this. So let's call this the floor. And we can duplicate this pretty easily. So I just Shift D, and I'm going to actually just Shift D and press Enter, so that way it stays right there. And so then maybe this is our door. Maybe we're making like a trap door kind of situation. All right, and so right now these are both positioned on top of one another. All right, so let's go ahead and just go to our top-down view real quick here. And all I'm going to do is I want to take that other layer here that I've created, and maybe I'm going to go to my floor layer, and I want to move that in a, let's just go ahead and use G, and let's have that move in, let's say, the Y direction. And if we have it move up, let's say 2, you can see where that, of course, ends up. And so right now these are perfectly duplicated. And you notice they end up in a nice good position. And one thing we should probably turn on is snapping, so that way these are bound within these kind of increment boxes, and we can check to make sure we're on increment, which is great. And what I want to do now is scale this guy down, so that way it's kind of going to form effectively the border around this other shape here. So let's go ahead and scale this down. Let's go ahead and scale it down by, let's say, 0.5, and you can see it will scale down this way. Well, that's not quite what we want. Instead, we want to scale it down in just one direction. So let's say we want to scale it down in the Y direction. And so let's say scale Y of 0.5. All right, and you can see that it gives me that. So maybe 0.25. Perfect. That looks actually pretty good. And then I can use just Z, Y, and I'll just bring that down. And I can snap right in. Perfect. And you notice we might have a little bit of discrepancy here, so I can actually just press G, and you can see how it would, again, snapping is really good for this because it makes sure these shapes are going to come together real nicely here. All right. And I want to actually duplicate this so that way I can get it to kind of form the rest of my barriers here. So I'm just going to go ahead and Shift D, and I'll use G and Y. So it stays along that Y axis, and so I'm just going to move that along. Again, you can see how snapping is coming into play here. And then all I'm going to do is, you can see it's not quite getting to where I want it to be. If I use Y again, you can see how it's trying to go inside of this box. And it's because, again, of how this geometry is set up. So even though I'm in the top-down view, it's not necessarily correlating to where it was because of these grid lines we're showing. So G, Y, and so you can see now it's going to be a lot nicer there. All right, that's, of course, giving me that side. Now let's go ahead and do our other sides here. So we want to go ahead and get these so they're lining alongside. So we're effectively creating a large box that's going to go this way. Let's go ahead and get another side here. So Shift D to duplicate this piece here. And all we're going to do is we want to move that into position. So I'm going to press G, and let's do along the X this time just to move it over a little bit. And then we'll go and move that to the Y, bring that on up. So it's kind of nice in the position where we want to be. And then we just want to rotate that by, let's just press in 90. And that should get me that right where I want that to be. And we want to move this over in the X direction, so we get a nice good snap there. So I'm just going to move that over till it snaps into place roughly where I want it to be. That's looking pretty good. And then we want to scale this. All right, so if we go ahead and press S to scale, one thing you'll notice is it doesn't quite snap to where I want it to be. So the trick here is I have to hold down Control in order to kind of get some of that snapping back. So if we try and scale this, again, you can see how that is not necessarily scaling 100% to where we want it to be. So if, again, control is going to be our friend here. So S to scale. And if we use Control, you can see how it's trying to snap to each of those little pieces there. Now, of course, you can see it's not quite where I want it to be. You can see that we had some growth here on this. So we may have to scale this in the different directions, because when we scale this, one thing to notice, I just rescaled it. I only want to scale this, let's say, in the Y direction. And so now, of course, it will scale appropriately. That looks pretty good. And then let's go ahead and duplicate that. And we'll just go ahead and move that along the, do G and X, so it moves right on over. All right, and now we have ourselves the start of what looks like a nice kind of almost like a trapdoor here, because we left this open. So these are all our floor components here. We have our door right here in the center. How can we then set this up to be a pivot? And notice we do have a little bit of some discrepancies here. with our door, but that's okay because you could argue that these are hinges. You could, of course, can come in here and clean this up more if you want to, but this is a good starting point here for what we want to do. All right, so if we are here in object mode, we go ahead and select now this plate here. Remember, our 3D cursor is currently right here, so we want to go ahead and move that. So I'm just going to go ahead and I can click on cursor, or I can go to the properties panel here. And if I am on the face here, I of course can have some of that in here. So underneath the various tools here, I have in the view, I have 3D cursor. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is, since I know this is a 2x2 cube that was here, I can go ahead and try to move this over. So let's just say I'll go ahead and set this. You can see I can kind of drag this right about where I want to be. 1 should be pretty good because, again, remember it's 2x2, so 1 would be the exact point there. And remember, we did compress this to a kind of a 0.1. So we're going to go ahead and make sure we move that Z to about 0.1. And that will then put this right at the top. Because otherwise it's going to pivot from inside the middle here. If we have a hinge here, it's probably going to come from the top. And all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that when I rotate this, I go to 3D cursor. Because I don't want it on one of the other modes. I want this to go off where the cursor is. And if I press my R for rotate, you can see that we can now get that to kind of rotate up and on there. But of course, we probably do want to restrict that in a certain direction. So let's just say the Y. And of course, you can see that we can now rotate that as if it was a hinged door. So that is a pretty cool step that we've taken today to be able to go ahead and get those different pieces in there. So hopefully that will give us some good things that we can use for things moving forward. We saw how all these different pieces can kind of play together and work off each other to make much more nice geometry.